Good evening and welcome to this episode of the Mary Trump Show. I am so excited to have with me as my guest today, Tim O'Brien, journalist, author of The Revelatory Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald, and executive editor and columnist at Bloomberg Opinion. Tim, hi, it's so good to have you.
Hey, Mary, it's great to be live with you instead of digital.
Right. And as we were saying before the break, it's weird because I feel like I've known you for a really long time because of your work, obviously. And just, you have a perspective on one of the things we're going to talk about that very, very, very few people have. And that's strangely unusual. Because I think you and I would both have thought that Donald's a pretty transparent person. He's exactly what he appears to be. And yet, here we are.
Here we are because people just routinely discount how damaging and destructive he can be. And he creates his own narrative.
And he creates his own narrative, but I think a lot of times other people create it for him and he just kind of jumps in as it serves his purposes. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, because listen, I think we know how dangerous it would be to pretend that Donald's not a problem anymore. That if we just ignore him, he'll go away. I think that's a terrible mistake. But I'm really sick of talking about him. Although again, it's necessary.
But we must.
We must. But
yeah.
I think what's becoming even more important, especially as we see these hearings unfold, is to talk about his enablers and the people who use him for their own ends and the people he uses. Because I have to be honest with you, one of the things that most shocked me was the extent to which Donald, and just I want to back up for a second. You actually have a much better sense of this than I do, because I didn't really start paying attention to Donald in the way one needed to until 2016. Before that, he was just sort of my estranged uncle. So
You're a estranged uncle who tried to rip off your inheritance.
Yeah, well, there's that. I found that out eventually. But seriously, he was Donald, and I didn't really want to pay attention to anything else until it became utterly necessary. But you've had your fingers on the pulse of this much longer than I have. The real concern is the people he finds, shockingly, who are even weaker than he is. How do we make sense of that?
Well, because I think he has this, he is not a sophisticated man. He's an ignorant man, but he has this reptilian sensibility about other people's vulnerabilities and the kind of people that come into his orbit. And I think either identify through him because they have a weak sense of themselves, they overestimate who he is, and they feel like they're in the sort of, buzzy orbit of the sun god. And then there's another group of people who see him as their useful idiot, someone who they think they can manipulate or use to further their financial or political or social ends. And as you well know, he grew up watching his father do this. And I first got exposed to Donald in the early 90s. I was a research assistant on the first kind of definitive investigative biography of Trump by Wayne Barrett, the great Village Voice investigative reporter. Mm-hmm. I grew up in the Midwest, didn't really know. I was aware of Donald Trump in the headlines, but I never looked at him closely as a businessman. And then I went on this deep dive as Wayne's research assistant in the early 90s. I did a book about gambling in the mid 2000s. I interviewed him for that. And then I was at the New York Times in the early 2000s and covered him for the paper, wrote Trump Nation. He sued me for that book and he lost. And over the course, I would say, and then he runs for president. In 2015, I began covering him again. So he's like the ghost of Christmas past. I can hear the chains up in the attic. And
what did you do to be punished like this?
I don't know. Something happened it must be karma. But the constant over all those years, say from the early 90s to 2022, is that he has always been surrounded by these two populations of people you just spoke about. And And I think he learned at his father's knees that you could get lawyers and fixers and other political operatives who could teach you how to weaponize the legal system and weaponize politics in your own financial favor. And then there would always be this group of hangers-on that would be willing to do dirty deeds for you. I don't think anyone ever thought that model would get transported right into the Oval Office and then be used to essentially stage a coup. And here we are.
I want to ask you something because it's important for people to understand how strange this all is in terms of where we are, the fact that things are worse than they've ever been in some ways, but
and dangerous.
But are you surprised by any of it? Are you surprised by anything that has unfolded because of him or anything he's done?
I'm never surprised by him, frankly. I think he has an immense capacity for tragic, comic, destructive, grotesque behavior. I am surprised by the willingness of people who can see right in front of themselves what he's doing. The entire GOP, major institutions, outside of political institutions, law enforcement, business institutions, academic institutions, and they essentially tell themselves lies and delude themselves. I think in the belief that he might go away, or he won't be as bad, or he can be channeled to get their own goals enabled and realized. And time again, he takes advantage of all of them, each and every single one of them. And I think, the lesson of Donald Trump's ascent into the White House, people shake their head and they say, well, how could this have happened? This is just dumbfounding. But he's an outcome. He's actually a symptom of I think, white nationalism and this lurch into propaganda and sensationalism and cultural division, racial division, as a substitute for policy, as a way to gain power. And I think the Republican Party learned decades ago that this was an effective path to power. They actually didn't need to preach policy. Mm-hmm. They just preached fear of the other. And they kept finding different vessels who could inhabit that message. And that sort of reached its apotheosis in Donald. Mm-hmm. And the real danger to me isn't just that he may return to the White House. It's that I think Trumpism, if we're defining Trumpism as white nationalism wedded to this propagandic fever, isn't going away. Ron DeSantis offers a version of it, Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, and it happens a bigger part of the Republican Party than when Donald first ascended. And I think that we're going to be living with that for a long time, whether or not he becomes president. And that's a problem.
Yeah, and you've been writing a lot recently about what's happening around him, and that's really where I want us to focus mostly today, because one of the things that has me worried about these hearings, although I'm less worried about it as the hearings go on, but still, is that Donald is going to be made the bad guy, which of course he is, but is going to be held accountable in lieu of everybody else, as if it were only him, if it were only his behavior and his divisiveness and his cruelty and his crimes, and have the entire Republican Party allowed to just pretend that they're fine, they're normal. Now that they've gotten rid of Donald, it's just business as usual. And I want to tease out a little bit those two groups you talked about, because I agree with you. Nothing Donald has done is surprising. I should say three groups. We have we talked earlier, the users and the people he uses, and in the middle, the people who continue to give him the benefit of the doubt. And that is mind blowing to me, when you and I have been saying for at least 2 years, well, you've been saying it longer than I have, and other people as well. There is no bottom. It will only get worse. So unfortunately, I credit a lot of why we're here with people's inability or unwillingness to face what's right in front of them. One, how bad he is, but two, how fragile democracy is and how extreme the Republican Party is.
You know, we have a lot of existential threats facing us right now: climate change, a public health crisis, and a political crisis. And I think one common thread that binds all these things, and I think, you know, you're far more, I think, sophisticated and steeped in psychology and human behavior than I. But I think people put reality in these little boxes that they tuck in the back of their head and don't open, when the threat in front of them is so existential and threatening. To actually call it for what it is would require them to take actions they're not prepared to take. The steps we'd have to take to really deal with climate change, the steps we'd have to take to make sure if there's more public health crises coming, that we've got a way to deal with it. And that if we are lurching towards fascism, as embodied by Donald Trump and now a larger wing of the Republican Party, what are we going to do about that? And you know, when you identify this middle group, it's very interesting, because I would put law enforcement squarely right there. That the hesitation that until recently appeared to define the Justice Department's actions towards Donald, after months and months of first news reporting that laid out what happened before, during, and after January 6th, and now those, you know, incredibly important January 6th hearings themselves that have laid out a pattern of criminality and intention on Donald Trump's part. Yet there's this kind of twiddling of the fingers. Well, you know, maybe he did break the law, maybe he didn't know. When the real issue is, the real hurdle isn't defining whether he's a criminal, he broke the law, and he tried to stage a coup. The hurdle is, can you convince a jury of that in a courtroom? And are you willing to sort of have the Justice Department go after the executive branch when it never has in history before? Those are moral and strategic choices. Those are not legal ones. We already know what the legal choice is.
Yeah.
And even so, the law enforcement officials are hesitant to take it. And he knows how to exploit that. And I think that, you know, right now, the people that are around the January 6th event, law enforcement, legislators, and the people that they're investigating, the legislators have finally hunkered down. I hope law enforcement does, because if Trump is not held accountable and the people around him are not held accountable, we are a deeply broken country, and maybe irretrievably broken.
And the fact that for a year and a half now, which is astonishing, Donald has been free to continue spreading his lies about the November election, about the insurrection. And we have 147 sitting members of Congress who are seditionists, in my view, still sitting in their seats of power, blocking. They're not making legislation; they're blocking legislation crafted by the Democrats. And still, I think Josh Hawley is the worst, most recent example of the dangers of that.
And he's a trained lawyer. Ted Cruz has a law degree. Ron DeSantis has a law degree. And all of them are embracing lawlessness.
That's right. And they're doing it with the knowledge of how best to undermine it. And that's, I think, the scary part. And you wrote about this recently, that it's not just about these individuals. It's about our institutions and the way that, look, if I can take a step back, I would say one of the good things, I guess, we learned during the Trump administration is just how fragile our institutions are, so we can take steps to shore them up. So, you know, that hopefully we've learned that, no, we can't depend on tradition and norms and human decency anymore. We need to codify everything. But on the other hand, we still have people who are willing, as soon as they get a chance, to find the weaknesses in the joints of those same institutions, and that's really what scares me.
And in that context, Mary, January 6th is a warm-up act.
Yes.
It is the crew around Donald figuring out where the soft points in the system are and how far they can use those soft points to break the entire structure, whether it's pressuring the vice president not to certify a result, or creating false slates of electors to replace those who were duly elected, or to file scores of bogus lawsuits against various state legislatures and secretaries of states about illegal vote counts, or against companies that tabulated the votes, or to simply propagate the big lie through a media alliance with Fox News to delude a huge portion of the American population into believing something occurred that didn't occur, that the election was stolen from Donald. And I think we know now that if he gets into the White House again, that they've now had practice at this, and they're not going to be put off by civil servants who might stand in the way of this stuff. They'll just fire all of them.
Yeah. What is it called? Schedule F? Is that is the game plan?
Yeah. And it's and the idea now that's been institutionalized in a number of states that local legislators in Republican-controlled state legislatures can review an election result and sort of decide willy-nilly whether or not they think it meets the sniff test, their own sniff test. That is the end of democracy, if a legislature can just say they don't believe in the results of a vote. And that's a microcosmic manifestation at all these little state levels of what that crew tried to do nationally after the 2020 election.
Yeah, and just to illustrate how deep the rock goes, or how far ranging it is, the Supreme Court is going to take up the Moore v. Harper case, which will basically set in stone, make constitutional the kinds of behavior you're talking about. And that is the end. I mean, luckily in 2022, we aren't going to be faced with the potentially dozens of secretaries of state or attorneys general who are running on the big lie, who are running to reinstall Donald or whatever. And Moore v. Harper hasn't been settled yet, but it's not, if anything, it should just increase people's urgency about what happens in 2022. And Tim, I have to be honest, I think that one of the things that's happening now, or at least appears to be happening, is that people like DeSantis are positioning themselves in contradistinction to Donald as an attempt, kind of like Youngkin did in Virginia, as an attempt to kind of make himself seem like a better alternative, even though, Ron DeSantis is a full-blown fascist and what he's doing in Florida is horrific. But DeSantis potentially would be more dangerous, I think, if he got to the Oval Office. The only thing that I have any hope about is the man has no charisma.
Well, and I don't think he's a great campaigner, and life is different when you have to actually get into a national campaign and make eye contact with people, which Ron DeSantis can't do. And he has some oddities that may or may not haunt him on the campaign trail. We don't know. I wouldn't be surprised. I think if he was paired with Kristi Noem or Nikki Haley, that would be a pretty potent ticket, I think, for Republican voters in this day and age. The other thing about all this, I was thinking about this earlier. We're sort of talking about what's been revealed, in the Trump era, and Trump he tore off this Band-Aid around myths that we've told ourselves about racial tolerance and social justice and economic progress in the United States. And there's been pools of these kinds of people in the US for generations. they just didn't find something to coalesce around until they were, I think, found one another on social media and found a messenger in Donald Trump who said it's okay to say the N-word. You don't have to bury that anymore. And it's okay to say that we shouldn't let black and brown and yellow people come into the United States. And that, the real issue is immigration, not automation. And all these various, false narratives of what was the cause of economic and social problems. And the only virtue in that to me is it's forcing us to stand up in opposition to it, not to just sit back and sit by the pool and have a lemonade. Yeah, this is bad, but to actually figure out what we're going to do if this is going to stop, because it has to stop. The amount of decay in trust and in the public dialogue and in our institutions, it's really at the breaking point.
And a lot of that, and I'm sure you are aware, it just unfortunately still seems to be the case that a lot of people in the mainstream media haven't gotten the memo yet that the Republican Party is not your father's or grandfather's Republican Party. And that's another concern as well, because by equating the parties, by equating the Democratic base and the Republican base, which I find deeply insulting, because, I'm part of the Democratic base. People in the Republican base are white supremacists, fascists, and misogynists and racists and all that other stuff. So there's no equivalent in the Democratic Party that has, certainly not any part of the Democratic Party that has power. So, the other issue is that then I'm still trying to process what's happening with this David Jolly, Christine Todd Whitman, and Andrew Yang fiasco.
Alternative.
Yes. That's between that and the way the media presents the parties as if they're equally bad. Who does that help? I don't think it helps Democrats.
I think the problem the Democrats have in this scenario is that it's a tolerant party. That's not a problem. That's a virtue. But when you embrace multiple voices, it is harder to keep everybody on message.
Yeah.
And the Republicans are very good at getting in line and staying on message, and then being programmatic in the service of their goals. To their credit, the Federalist Society began planning for a conservative sweep of the court system in 1983 or so, and then patiently worked at that for year after year. Whether or not you agree with them ideologically, from a programmatic strategic standpoint, they hunkered down and got the job done. When the Dobbs decision gets overturns Roe v. Wade, the Democrats are on the steps of the Capitol singing "God Bless America," and kumbaya does not work.
No,
this has got to be a classic political battle, and that involves, you can't fight fire with fire. The Democrats can't engage in propaganda and lies in the path to power because the Republicans do it so effectively. They can't embrace violence, but they have to find a way to get up close to voters who don't feel that they are present enough. And I think some of these third-party movements, are trying to do that. The problem is, I don't think any third-party movement in the U.S. in the modern era right now can really get traction anyway, because the apparatus is really controlled everywhere by both the Republicans and the Democrats. So I think if you want change and you don't want the Republican Party to continue to get away with using lawlessness and sensationalism to essentially defenestrate the federal government, which is what this is. That's where the Supreme Court is. That's why various factions in the Republican Party unite, is that ultimately what this is about is the government should just run the army and keep the borders safe and closed, and then get out of everyone's way.
Right.
And however that happens is fine, even if it involves lying, because that's a good result philosophically to those folks. And Democrats have to understand how to make a good argument for why government can be a positive force in people's lives, good for the economy, good for every individual, good for civic liberties. And I don't think the Dems have done a good job messaging around that enough and campaigning on it.
I agree. First of all, bonus points for using the word defenestrate. Great word. And totally appropriate in this context.
I'm going to get more multisyllabic words in this conversation before we're done.
Please. I like them. So yes, what I'm getting at though is that by giving the Republican Party a pass, for example, the fact that bills in the House passed to protect, I can't even believe I have to say this, to protect the right to access contraception without government interference, to protect same-sex marriage, to protect interracial marriage, to make sure that there are no Nazis in our army or law enforcement, that all of those things that passed in the House. No, all of those things were passed with 100% of Democratic support. And depending on the issue, 0 Republicans or a handful of Republicans. So again, that disadvantages the Democrats because it makes it seem like, everybody's doing great stuff. And then Republicans don't get called on their rhetoric. And, it seems like these ridiculous, quote unquote, woke issues. I hate that word. Woke means kind, basically, kind and open-minded. So
again, who turned the term woke into a opprobrium? What turned it into a slag? The Republicans took control of that word.
Yes. No, but that's what I'm saying, and I think I agree. Republicans are expert at co-opting language. No doubt about it. But unfortunately, and the Democrats do this sometimes, so no Democrat ever should have conceded pro-life ever. But the media do too. It's pro-life versus anti-choice versus pro-choice, when it should be pro-choice and anti-choice or whatever. So, and you hit on it earlier too. So we have the messaging issue. We have this, the way it's presented as the Republicans are getting just as much accomplished in Congress as the Dems, which is not true. And then the language issue, which the Republicans are just better at. And I want to connect that to what you said earlier, which is entirely, I think, one of the biggest problems we have. As the Republicans have become more monolithic and more narrow, the Republicans, as you said, have had to become a bigger tent, which is harder. But don't you think part of that is because the Republicans have finally, maybe it's not true yet, but in the next election cycle or two, it will be true that the Democrats don't need a majority anymore because they've rigged the system so wildly in their favor?
Well, I mean, we know that's going on already through gerrymandering and through, I think, the kind of parliamentary maneuvers that the Mitch McConnells of the world engage in, and the Congress is set up by virtue of the structure of the Senate and the House, that essentially you can create strategic pluralities that exist at the legislative level, even though they're not a reflection of popular will. That's where we are right now. That's why you don't get gun legislation, even though gun violence is a scourge. And I think this push to decentralize decision-making and lawmaking in the name of returning power to the state is really, again, about using the states as laboratories, I think, for an assault on democracy, actually.
Yeah.
Not to make not to make people quote unquote freer.
Oh, absolutely not. And that's another structural problem. I mean, we've known about it for a long time, but I don't think we've understood until the last 5 years just how grotesquely unfair the filibuster is and the Electoral College is.
Because it had hit a crisis before we paid attention. I think you and I might have been paying attention. I think there were people that saw this coming and warned about it. But, people did not think about this with enough intensity and a sense of purpose until it was too late. And now we're living with it. I mean, I think we're in the early stages of a complete upheaval on how American democracy and legislation work.
And it's and I don't think
it's a happy podcast.
It'll get happier. Just give it a couple minutes. It's going to get happier.
You and I got on
not right now.
Make everybody happy.
And you know what, Tim? I was thinking about this. I don't even know why. Like, for example, a few days ago, I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning wondering how it would unfold if they decided to indict Donald. Like, this is what we have to think about now. But I was thinking about the fact that not only that when asked the question, will you concede the election if you lose, but the fact that the question was even asked in the first place. I think that, if nothing else, just shows us how far we've fallen.
And if you're going to ask that question, if it's on your mind, why aren't you taking steps well before you ask that question to make sure he can't? The U.S. system was not prepared for somebody like Donald Trump, a pathological liar who had no hesitation about using powerful institutions to achieve small, self-serving goals. That essentially, as you well know, you can understand almost everything Donald does through two lenses: it's either self-aggrandizement or self-preservation. It's very rarely any other two things. It's not complex.
Right.
And if that's not in front of him, that's what animates him when he gets activated. The rest of the time, he's munching on a cheeseburger, watching sports, and doesn't read and doesn't care about anything else.
Right.
And I think he realized on the job, I don't think he knew coming into the White House that the presidency allowed the kind of latitude it does. And he discovered that. And then after getting, impeached and voted out of office, he discovered it was also a way to fundraise and to make money. And again, he learned it on the job. And the really dark part of this whole tale is he had bad enough instincts and motives coming into the White House, and then he learned in the White House that the power of the presidency allowed him to be even worse and to be insulated from the consequences of his own actions. As you also know, that's one of the most astounding things about his entire life is he's had these concentric rings of insulation. He was born into a privileged family, and so his father's wealth and influence protected him from the consequences of those actions when he was younger. And then he became the host of a reality TV show, and he got the power of celebrity, which he always recognized. You can grab them by the who, what's it, they'll let you do that if you're a star. Yeah. And then the presidency. And each one of these things, prevented him from learning from his own grotesque mistakes throughout his life. The rest of us have to do that if we want to mature and become adults. He's been 7 years old. He has been a rich kid for his entire life.
And I would put it in these terms. He's been institutionalized his entire life. Like, when has this guy ever had to literally support himself?
Never. Even when he drove, his own business empire holdings into bankruptcy, his father bailed him out. His siblings bailed him out.
That's right.
The banks let him off the hook.
Exactly. And, Tim, I've wanted to ask you this question for a really long time. When I first started writing my first book, one of the things that kind of pulled me up and really shocked me, because again, I'd never had to think about it in these terms, was the patterns that persisted throughout his life. And we've talked about it, and those were patterns that sort of you recognized through the writing of the book. Yeah, because I was looking at my family as a system, and then looking at Donald's relationship with the media as a system, and then his relationship with banks as a system, and then with the Republican Party. So, and in every instance, there was always somebody there to enable him, use him. I mean, it
help him avoid culpability.
Yes, accountability, exactly. And you said about concentric circles. Exactly. They've grown larger as the power that accrues to being in that particular circle grows larger, as the reach grows larger, as the ability to get away with things grows larger. And that was probably the most dangerous thing about the first impeachment. I think the ridiculous Senator Susan Collins said that, of course he'll learn his lesson because it's really, being impeached is really bad. Well, being impeached with no consequences, what the fuck does he care? It's just,
and you don't learn lessons if you don't think you have any lessons to learn.
Exactly.
And,
so how do you make sense of that? Because I've identified the patterns. I still can't make sense of them though, because it's quite stunning. The through line
of why people and institutions acquiesce
from Fred on down. I mean,
I think there's different factors. Like we could probably sit around trading war stories together for hours on how each why did why did Fred defer to Donald so thoroughly and vilify your father and terrorize his daughters and leave his wife isolated home alone, and out of that whole maelstrom, Donald emerges as the one he decides can be the vessel for his own dreams and sort of protects him financially because of it. And Roy Cohn recognizes there's something in this guy, and then Steve Bannon and Roger Stone, and I think all of those people have different views into their own needs and human frailty, and they thought they could take advantage of him. The one time I really got worried about why reputable institutions and smart people sort of succumbed to him was the Mueller investigation, because the sort of tender-footedness Mueller had around going down a road that could lead to a prosecution and really presenting a really airtight series of charges against him, and I think looking at his finances, Mueller chose not, which is the main motivating force for him outside of his own ego and his unhinged behavior. He's media attention and greed are huge things for him. And we still don't know the monetary reasons for why he embraced Putin, but they're financial. It's not just that he's fascinated with dictators. He saw Putin as a cash register. And that problem hasn't been solved. And Mueller just chose to, I'm going to let the U.S. attorney look at that. I'm not going to look at that because this is the presidency. And sort of looking at Trump in terms of what's around him, what people presume where he comes from and what he's about, as opposed to what his actions really tell you. People just don't accept his actions at face value. And they're just bald, undeniable indicators of who he is and what he does.
Yeah, and that's another thing that's mystifying. Anybody else who is a serial criminal, every crime they commit makes it worse and makes them it makes it more urgent that we arrest them or whatever. And with Donald, it's like, oh well, he did this terrible thing, but he did this other terrible thing, so we're going to forget about the first terrible thing. And it's just
and there's so many of them that there's thousands of them, so you forget the first 950 because thinking about the most recent 50 is intense enough. And I don't think traditional institutions know what to do with him. I think it's hard for the legacy media operating these sort of rules around, counterbalanced objective reporting. It's easy for me because I'm a columnist. I can just say, I think this is what it is. And I think law enforcement giving him extra deference because he's the president when he's clearly a dangerous and lawless operator. It's just, it's gone on too long. People have woken up too late. I think, Liz Cheney is a great example of this. I think she's a model citizen right now. I think, I don't agree with her on a lot of her policy positions, probably maybe all of them.
Yeah.
But I think she's a great public servant and a really honorable person. But I wish she had come to this 8 years ago, and others like her in the party.
Well, listen, I think when you are in it to achieve your own policy ends, clearly, almost the entirety of the Republican Party was willing to look the other way because they were getting their Muslim ban and they were getting the tax cuts for rich people, and they were getting the Voting Rights Act essentially gutted and thrown away, and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very grateful that Representatives Cheney and Kinzinger had a line that could be crossed. But part of the problem is that it took way too long for his behavior to get egregious enough for them. And that's what worries me about this incredibly fraught moment we're in.
Sorry.
No. I was just going to say, you can put it, you can go where you were going to go. You can put it in the context of this, whatever you want to do. But I'm just thinking, let's say if Donald doesn't get held accountable, that's the worst thing that could happen. But if he does, and it becomes only him and his work, the Kraken who get indicted or what have you, but the rest of the party gets off the hook. That's a lesson for the Tom Cottons and the Josh Hawleys and the Ted Cruzes and the Ron DeSantises. And if they ever find anybody who's smart with charisma, we are in serious jeopardy.
I couldn't agree more. I remember in like 2015 and 2016 talking with some friends, and I think it can be facile sometimes to compare our current situation to Nazism, but we also have to recognize that there are parallels. And Ellen Bullock wrote this great biography of Hitler, I think entirely just on documents he got he was a British historian, and it was one of the first sort of authoritative biography of Hitler. And I remember reading that book, and there's a chapter in there about the 1933 election and Hitler's rise to power. And German industrialists didn't want socialists and communists to take over the workforce on their shop floors. So it was a very useful alliance for them to link up and empower these cartoonish brown shirts who basically made sure that the left kept out of the shop room floor. And then they thought they could control that group's leader, Hitler, because they were all these cartoonish guys who liked to march. And the final line in that chapter, when Bullock is talking about that alliance, is that the industrialists and the German conservative elite were about to learn what it meant to ride the back of a tiger. And I quoted that to people in 2015 and 2016. I said, people are about to learn what it means to ride the back of a tiger. And it has played out in, the Republicans and the conservatives and who saw Trump as a tool for getting a tax cut in a conservative court and thought it would end there without damage, have been proven wildly wrong.
Yeah, it's like that cartoon, voting for the leopard eating your face party because they tell it like it is, like, okay, like if you just want somebody to be straightforwardly telling you they're going to eat your face off, and you think that's
and while you're singing Kumbaya.
Yeah, exactly. And we're getting back to Kumbaya, and this is something that's driven me crazy, and I make it a policy. I mean, I don't think I've done this 100% of the time because I'm human, but I rarely criticize the Democrats on policy, because my answer to anybody who thinks I should is, imagine where we would be right now if January 6th succeeded, or by some horror Biden had lost, or it had been so close that they were able to pull a 2000 Bush v. Gore. Imagine. And also what Biden inherited is insane. the horrors that he inherited and had to deal with and untangle. So no, I am not going to criticize the Dems on policy. However, because I believe, I know this has become a truism, but it's true. 2022 is the most significant election of our lifetime. If we lose, meaning the pro-democracy people, not just Democrats, but people who care about democracy, if we lose in 2022, I think it's over. Because it will be, the obstacles to winning in 2024 will become potentially insurmountable. So I think it's fair to criticize the Democrats if we think they're not fighting hard enough. And I don't mean to sound simplistic, but I actually think that's, people thought Donald was fighting for them, even though, of course, he wasn't. Democrats are, like, democratic policies really are good for people. I think we just want obvious signs that they're doing the fighting, even if they don't accomplish what they want to accomplish.
They're able to own and explain their successes.
Yeah.
You know, the GDP has grown faster under Democratic administrations than Republican administrations. Democratic management of the economy has been better for people than Republicans, but it is commonly believed among a lot of voters that Republicans are better stewards of the economy. And this is just in the data. That's not even ideologically, it's not an ideologically drawn observation. It's the fact pattern. But I think the Dems have a hard time convincing people that effective, efficient, sophisticated governance is good for everybody when it's orchestrated and used properly, and that in this era when a big part of the population has had to move out of industrial jobs and either can't inhabit service jobs or can't get trained to get there, people feel displaced, and neither party, I think, for a couple of decades now has really provided good answers to the plight of those people, working Americans who've been displaced. But I think the Democrats have tried to provide better answers. The problem is you've got a big swath of the population that's distressed, another part of the population that's, racist, and the Republicans have figured out how to tell both distressed populations that they're on their side.
Yeah, I don't think we have the luxury of telling people how sophisticated approaches to government work, and we just don't. I think.
Well, we have to get people to the voting booth.
We do, and I think that I think the most basic thing I want, just as a starting point, is for Democrats to recognize their enemy and to understand that the Republican Party is not a party that you want to work with anymore. Even if it were possible, why would you want to work with these people who, as you know, just voted against giving health care to veterans who have cancer because there were burn pits where they were serving our country? Exactly. So I think part of it is just like distinguishing themselves. And then, like you said, keeping it really simple. There are charts that just show you how many jobs Democratic presidents have created versus Republican presidents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you're absolutely right about that. It is about just getting the news out there. And
engaging with voters where they live.
Yes. Meeting people where they are is incredibly important. I have two questions for you. The first one is, what do you think is the best? We didn't actually really talk about the January 6th committee hearings that much, but hopefully you'll join us for our live stream of the next one, because I know there will be more, and it's actually a really cool way to watch the hearings. Yeah. And we get to kind of comment in real time and analyze during and after. So it just kind of helps process it in real time, because as you know, it's been pretty gobsmacking on occasion. But the hearings aside, what do you think that is the best case scenario vis-a-vis Donald's relationship with the Republican Party and whether or not he's going to run? The best case scenario for us, for us pro-democracy people.
Well, I mean, I think we've started to see the impact of the January 6th committee hearings on voters, in addition to, I think the Dobbs ruling and the guns ruling were big motivating factors for people realizing that their civil liberties and reproductive rights were at risk in a way that they hadn't fully contemplated. And I think independents are turning away from that part of the party. There's just this wild card of what's happening with the economy and inflation. There's a good chance it could worsen. We go into a recession that's just going to be bad for those occupying office right now. So I think some of this isn't in people's control. So a best case scenario is that we don't go into a recession, that we come out of that recession, job growth continues, and the economy perks up again, and people focus on making sure their rights aren't getting stripped from them by this court and this party. And you know, I think that the map in the Senate has gotten bluer.
Yeah.
And I think the map in the House has gotten less red, but is still significantly plus red. And so I think the best case scenario is a divided Congress. I don't think the Democrats are going to retain control of Congress. And I think the best case scenario is a divided Congress and a competitive 2024 presidential election. And I think it could be competitive if the Democrats have a ticket that is appealing to enough people to create a plurality. And I don't know what that ticket is. I don't know Biden's approval ratings, and Biden's a great public servant. He's an honest man. He's a good person. But his leadership's been pell-mell.
Well, I mean, if people are only focusing on inflation and high gas prices, I don't think anybody could overcome that. And
it's true.
Given everything, I have very specific feelings about that issue. But I think it's a little too soon to talk about that. That is something that we need.
It could really change.
Yeah, exactly. And things could even change between now and November. It's not that far away, especially those of us who were still living in COVID time, when a month feels like a day and a day can feel like a century. But that's a lot of time. But this is not my last question. I have one more question. Do you think, though, that Donald can play a factor, or can be a factor, in 2022? Because I think that's also potentially something that could work in our favor.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, I think if the question is he a negative factor? Is he dead weight? Is he on certain tickets? I think absolutely, and I think we've already seen that in some races. I certainly don't think he's a kingmaker, and I think the January 6th hearings have really painted him nationally for what he is in a fully realized way. I think there's more work to be done, but there's no question that lots of people have understood that he's a lawless operator, a criminal, and a threat to democracy. What we don't know yet is, are they going to take action around that? But I think the Republicans now know that he's a drag on certain tickets, and DeSantis and Pence are sort of openly flaunting him. And there's some funding moving away from him. It hasn't moved away from him en masse, right. but there's definitely, that's also a barometer of where the party is.
Yeah, and I think the good news too is that although the country is paying attention and reevaluating, Donald's paying attention to January 6th, but it's not going to modify his behavior in any way. So
I think it's going to actually activate him. It's going to enrage him, right?
Yep.
Because he's a toddler.
Exactly. That's exactly what I meant. And I think that's a good thing, especially if he announces. So I told him, I'm sure he listens to me. I told him I think he needs to announce his run before the 2022 midterms, because that way the election will be all about him, and he'd like that. So
he would,
we'll see.
And it would be bad for the party.
Exactly. And I think he would like that too at this point. Okay. So last question. I'd like to just kind of take a step back and step away from the darkness, because it is, it's very trying. And exhausting to be steeped in this all the time, even though, as you said, we can't turn away. Hopefully someday we can take a break, but not right now. However, we do need to be doing other things. So I just was just curious, like what are you doing now to kind of decompress, de-stress, anything you're watching or any
Well,
hobbies you
I
have?
will sound so boring, but I love my family, and
How is that boring?
my family's a refuge
Have you met
and
the
a
Trump
joy.
family? That's a good thing.
Yes. All right, I'm talking to the choir here, and I'm preaching to the choir. The I love to read. My most recent favorite book was A Swim in a Pond in the Rain by George Saunders, the great short story writer. It's a beautiful. I think you should read it. It's a beautiful book on writing. And
Cool.
he teaches a creative writing class at Syracuse University, and he's
Fabulous.
a lovely man. And that's a great book. I love film. Uh, um, I love narrative television. I would recommend a slightly old French TV show called Le Bureau, The Bureau, about French intelligence. Great series. My wife and I cook together. I love to garden. We like to travel. I guess this is like I'm ticking off all the, and I've got 3 amazing children.
Oh,
and
nice.
And so I feel lucky, but I also feel like, the beauty in my life is under threat in the era that we're in right now too.
Exactly. And not to bring everybody down again, but I think that it is true that it's an additional stressor, because so much is at stake for our children's generation. My daughter's 20, and her life has basically been bracketed by September 11th because she was born a month after, and what's happening now. So
what are your refuges?
I also read a lot. I've never had COVID, but I have COVID brain, so I have a lot of time focusing. So I just sort of I read murder mysteries. I've been rereading Josephine Tay because that's sort of it's like a vacation. It just feels like going home, honestly. And I'm trying to just detox, get back in shape. COVID has taken its toll on everybody. So hopefully I'm heading up to Cape Cod soon.
I'll sound like a 1%er. I love the Peloton bike for COVID exercise.
You know what?
Bike in the basement.
There's nothing wrong with making use of what you have. I'm serious, because anything that anybody can do to kind of get healthy in these dark times is really important. But
it's also nice to be on this show and talk about life and issues with you. That's also a form of therapy.
I have to be honest. I always look forward to this. And as I said at the beginning, it's really great to meet you, even though I feel like I've known you forever. And hopefully we can meet in person one of these days when you're back in the States.
And thank you for your courage and your sense of purpose.
I appreciate that. Honestly, I don't think what I did took any courage, but I appreciate that. But sense of purpose, absolutely. And you're right there as well. So Tim O'Brien, it was such an honor and pleasure. And please stay safe, and hopefully we will talk soon.
You too, Mary. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Right. I want to thank my incredible guest, Tim O'Brien, journalist, author of Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald, and the executive editor and columnist at Bloomberg Opinion. It was seriously, I have been following Tim's work for a very, very long time. And as I said at the outset, he's one of the few people who has had access to Donald and therefore has unique insights into him. So as you guys all know, it would be fantastic if we could pretend Donald didn't exist anymore, but he's still a major factor in what happens to our country in the future. So it's always great to get Tim's take in particular on how we're going to negotiate this and what we need to understand. So thank you to all of you for being here. I just want to remind you that next Tuesday at 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific, we will have our strategy sessions with the Nerd Adventures and special guests. We're going to be talking at length about the Supreme Court decision, Dobbs, which overturned Roe v. Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood, which basically has rendered women in this country second-class citizens and has given states the power to imprison them essentially and force them to give birth to children they can't afford, don't want, or in some circumstances to fetuses that are not viable, which only serves to put the mother's life in danger. So it's an incredibly important conversation. I really hope you will join us. And of course, next Thursday, our usual show, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. You can find both of these at youtube.com/Politicon. And while you're there, please subscribe to the Politicon channel. It's free, so don't worry about that. And like the episode. Also, click that subscribe button, because if you do, you will automatically be notified anytime a new video drops, and not just the episodes, but the shorter videos that I've started doing to help us keep up with the insane pace of news. You can also, of course, listen to the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and give the show a 5-star review, because it really does help people find the show. And we are trying to spread the word. And I think it's really important to amplify voices of all of the Nerd Avengers and guests like Tim. So thank you again and always for being here. I will see you Tuesday. In the meantime, please stay safe and be kind.